So much has changed since the last Biota recording, and I wanted to give an update to folks because I wanted to test the community. I wanted to see who listens to this particular podcast feed still, what their expectations are, and whether they would like ongoing discussion associated with the topics that have been raised in the Biota podcast so far. So I am now recording January 2019, and the original site, Bruce Damer is taking that in a different direction. We may get Bruce Damer on in a future recording to talk a little bit more about his plans for the future for the original Biota site. But independently of that, I talked to Bruce about moving the Biota podcasts to biotacast.org, which is where you'll find the Biota podcast going forward. And I would also like to invite anyone who listens to this recording who is interested in talking about the topics that were raised in the Biota podcast historically to get in contact with me. My email address is Barbalet, my last name at gmail.com. That's Bravo Alpha Romeo, Bravo Alpha Lima Echo Tango at gmail.com. And if you have a project or if you have ideas that you want to talk about, by all means, please get in contact. So aside from the different direction from the original site, a bunch of additional things have gone on with the community. I was on the International Society of Artificial Life board for a couple of years. I'm not really sure when that ended. I was kind of removed and then emailed a few months after the fact. So that was an interesting experience, more perhaps to editorialize in the future. In addition, the project that I've worked on for the past nearly 23 years now, Noble Ape, went through an extreme intellectual property rights assault over the past 2.5 years. I can narrate that in a future podcast if anyone is interested. But I've continued to develop Noble Ape over this period of time as well. Interested in exploring the cityscapes, which I've worked on quite a bit, Planet Noble Ape, wide variety of bits and pieces of Noble Ape I've been working on over, since the last Biota recording that was in the feed. And I've added information to the feed periodically as I've had podcasts that I think might interest Biota podcast listeners. But what I'm interested in doing in 2019 is redefining what the Biota podcast is. I'm perfectly happy actually to resume Biota Live. However, I'll use Skype to do the recordings going forward. And in parallel to this, I had a podcast called Model Rail Radio that I started around the time that Biota Live was still running. Model Rail Radio is still ongoing. It's an amazing kind of podcast community engine. And if I was going to return to anything with the Biota podcast community, it would be very similar to what has happened with Model Rail Radio, be it a wide variety of hobbyists calling in, creating a community, an organic community, an international organic community to represent a variety of things and talk about a variety of interests and phenomena. So if the Biota podcast is going to be relaunched, and I'm very sympathetic to doing that currently, I will probably need 2 or 3 other folk, maybe 3 or 4 other folk, to get in contact from this podcast feed and just say to me, hey, Tom, we're interested in talking, we have existing projects. Even if you don't have existing projects, if you're interested in talking about the wide variety of topics that were covered originally in the Biota podcast feed, please get in contact with me, because what I'm interested in doing is creating a small roster of folk that are interested in talking and starting to record podcasts again, very similar to what we did with Biota Live, but just allowing voices in the community to have a point of outreach through this particular podcast, because I know certainly while the podcast hasn't been actively being recorded for a few years now, let's just say a few years, there have certainly been folks that have contacted me periodically and said, we really love the Biota podcast. Like, we've started listening afresh, interesting topics, interesting ideas. And I don't think that community has really died. It's just the wide variety of folk that used to participate on a regular basis with the Biota podcast have gone on to do other things. So I'm restarting the feed in some regard. I might provide monologues for the feed early on if folks don't get in contact, but just to give a sense of what's gone on with me personally and what's gone on, I guess, with the kind of broad themes that were originally covered in the Biota podcast. There are lots of ins and outs, lots of things that have gone on, and certainly in terms of Bruce Damer's own thinking, that has gone in a variety of different directions too. So hopefully we'll be able to have Bruce on in the future to talk about some of those ideas. But I thought this was too important a resource not to maintain it in some very real sense, not to continue the recordings, not to contribute to a community which certainly was there a few years ago, and I think actually through certain ebbs and flows is still there. It just needs a central focus like the Biota podcast recordings were historically. So Tom Barbalet still in the San Jose Bay Area. I think I've been here since the last recordings were recorded. look forward to potentially recording future pilot recordings with folks that are still interested in talking about these topics. My email address again, Barbalet, my surname, Bravo Alpha Romeo, Bravo Alpha Lima Echo Tango @gmail.com. Tom Barbalet in the San Francisco Bay Area, signing out.